Good evening. I'm Lori Salganikoff with the Chestnut Hill Conservancy, an educational center and advocate for the architecture, open space, sustainability, and history of Chestnut Hill and surrounding neighborhoods in the Wissahickon watershed. Before we dive into our last lecture for 2021, I'd just like to thank every member, supporter, neighbor, volunteer, and steward for your part in strengthening our communities. I can report that we are well on our way toward meeting our ambitious $44,000 year-end appeal goal. But if you didn't win the Eagles tickets and Schmitter raffle this week that one lucky donor won, donors through December will have additional chances at other fabulous raffle items, but most will go for just one day, so you need to watch your email. This evening, we're proud to welcome Dr. Paul Farber of Monument Lab, whose work may widen our eyes to new ways of documenting and sharing our histories. This is a complicated topic, and we look forward to a wonderful presentation and a civilized discussion afterward. Dr. Farber's presentation of about 45 minutes will be followed by a 15-minute question and answer session moderated by our friend, George McNeely, who is himself a celebrated scholar of monuments. We'd like to enjoy his presentation uninterrupted, so please put comments or questions in the chat or wait until the end to speak. Tonight's lecture and much of our work this year is made possible by our generous members and supporters. The Conservancy's lead sponsor for 2021, Bryn Mawr Trust Wealth Management, and tonight's lecture, which is generously sponsored by JB Ward and Ken Leroy, is here from JB Ward to welcome you. After Ken's welcome, the Conservancy's Program Committee co-chair will introduce Dr. Farber and Monument Lab. So if you're not Ken Leroy, please mute now. But if you are Ken, please say hello.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. We at John B. Ward Arborist are really glad to be a supporter of the Chestnut Hill Conservancy. We support the Conservancy because the Conservancy supports the community, and this community here in Chestnut Hill and the general community in the Northwest really cares. We care about people, we care about the buildings, you care about the open space, and of course, you care about the trees, and that's where we come in. Because we care about the trees, but we also care about our employees and we care about our clients. And we try to do a real pro job. Actually, John Ward started the company, and his first job in horticulture was at the Andorra Nursery, the local nursery over in Andorra. Now, Jim and Matt and Chris Ward operate the business, and I'm fortunate enough to be a part of it. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I live in East Mount Airy and support the community. And we just are glad to be a supporter of the Conservancy and hope to continue.
Thank you so much, Ken, and thanks so much for all the great work that you and JB Ward does for our trees. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jean McCoubrey, who will introduce our speaker, Dr. Paul Farber.
Hey, yeah, we're thrilled to introduce Paul Farber. I still haven't met him in person, but several times digitally. And he's a longtime Northwest Philadelphia resident, so he's one of us. And I'm just going to give you the abridged version of his many roles and accomplishments. Besides being the director and co-founder of Monument Lab, he is also the senior research scholar at Penn's Center for Public Art and Space. And this year, he's also a visiting professor at George Washington University, professor of community engagement, and which involves some commuting, I hear. And his team at Monument Lab were the inaugural grantees of the Andrew Mellon Foundation's Monuments Project, about which we'll hear more from Paul, which it was a $250 million initiative to transform the way our country's histories are told in public spaces. And this effort included the Monument Lab's ambitious national monument audit, and also opening up of research field offices throughout the US. Dr. Farber's research and curatorial projects explore transnational urban history, cultural memory, and creative approaches to civic engagement. He has also edited and contributed to numerous art and history publications. And his academic background is that he earned a PhD and MA in American culture from University of Michigan, and also a BA in urban studies from Penn. So welcome, Paul, and we can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Jean. Thank you, everyone. This is really a treat. I am here in my home in Westmount area, a block away from where I grew up. And as with any event, essentially, that I get to do, I'm very lucky because I see my parents in the audience here. So they like to show up. Hey, yep, hey, mom, hey, dad, there you go. And they live around the corner. I'm very lucky. I've been many places in the world. I've lived in Berlin and California and Michigan and Washington, D.C., but to be home in Northwest Philadelphia is really special. I spent a lot of my time virtually and or in person traveling to places around the country, around the world, thinking about their monuments and sites of memory. And, of course, this is something that plays out in local ways and national and international ways. I was in Cleveland last week, Toronto a few weeks ago, but tonight be able to be talking to my neighbors in Chestnut Hill, Mount Airy, Germantown, or virtually connected somewhere else, but nonetheless being present is really special. So I'm going to share my screen in a moment. And what I'm going to do is talk through a bit. Here, I'm going to give you a little bit of context of the work that I do, the work of Monument Lab. We're a nonprofit public art and history studio. We're based here in Philadelphia, but we do work around the country, around the world, thinking about the past, present, and future of monuments. Again, this is work that has been incredibly rewarding and meaningful. It's hard work. We work with artists and municipal agencies and community organizations, and really at that crossroads of all the different ways that not just monuments in a conventional sense, but the way that public memory lives in a city. And so just before to begin, I was thinking, as I'll take you through a journey around Monument Lab, I'll be talking about our National Monument Audit, which you can get on our website. You can download it for free or search it, or you can get a print copy and support our work at monumentlab.com. I was thinking a lot about, not just my own personal memory in Northwest Philadelphia, but places of public memory that are significant. And of course, places like Vernon Park, Pastorius Park, Germantown Avenue itself, the cobblestones feel like a profound monument, whether intentional or unintentional to the past. There are all kinds of places all throughout the Wissahickon. These are incredibly important, not just for each of us personally, but I think even, gestured to you, Ken, and others while we're here. This is the pieces that hold us together now, have held us together, and hopefully will be the means to move forward. And of course, we'd be remiss to not say that we're in a moment of reckoning and reimagining around our monuments and sites of memory, as we try to think about ways to no longer delay fuller justice, equity, and belonging. And so what I want to talk through tonight is not a single fix or a simple solution, but really talk about the complexities and start where we are. And so I thought I got to start this talk with one of the most meaningful places of memory for me in Northwest Philadelphia. And I was thinking about this one. I had to dig in my archive. I'm not a history buff, but I'm a memory buff. This is young Paul at the Germantown Jewish Center at the day of a dedication of a fountain. And so this is a place that's still, the synagogue that my family and I go to. I started there in nursery school. It's amazing when you return back home, like you can see yourself as evolving and growing. And then like you'll bump into the place you went to nursery school, and it really grounds you and humbles you, at least in good ways. I was thinking about this site, I was thinking about my family. I was thinking about, the history of Germantown Jewish Center that I kind of understood while I was, even as a young child, because we all are getting a sense of what's going on around us. Some of my earliest stories about history, memory, about social justice happened in the synagogue and around it, in partnership and in solidarity with interfaith partners. But then in reading Abigail Purgis's really amazing book on Westbound Erie, Making Good Neighbors, I learned about Germantown Jewish Center as a part of a network of really deliberate projects and initiatives contesting segregation in Philadelphia and in Northwest Philadelphia at that. That made sense to me in continuity. So one of the reasons I chose this is you can see me here with my handprint. But this is a site, if you go to today, and I have tried, my handprint just several decades later is almost traced out and beyond recognition. This is not a site of extreme conservation. And so it really reminded me of memory as powerful, but memory as fragile, and thinking about what it means for, on one hand, structures and sites to hold history and memory, and how do we hold it on our own? And how do we reinforce those bonds? So I wanted to start here and kind of ground us and ground myself. And again, kind of note the kind of special character of this talk, even as I prepare to bring you to many other places, where the original thinking and the original lab work was happening before I even knew it. So I'm going to start here with, what is a monument? And this is a question I'll be asking throughout my presentation. And of course, monuments, in many ways, those things that we conventionally refer to as monuments, may conjure for us bronze and marble figures on high. But of course, when we trace the word monument, and I'll be talking a lot about the different definitions of monument, it's used in everyday parlance in all kinds of different ways. Monument refers to a trace of the past. Monument can be archaeological, architectural. In the United States, it's ecological. Our national monuments are sites where we think of as nature, even as they are framed out and contained with particular designations and resources. There's that phrase, unintentional monument, but sometimes people point to a piece of infrastructure, a closed school, a closed factory, as something that wasn't meant to be conveying a lesson about the past into the present, but nonetheless does in a big way. And then, of course, when we think about monuments, we're also thinking about people gathering around them. How could you not think about monuments and people when we think about projection and poetry and protest? And this is something I want to keep thinking about, that actually, despite the centrality of monuments in our cities and towns, in our public consciousness, in the zeitgeist, there is no one consensus definition of a monument. And I would argue that both creates turmoil on the civic and social levels, and opportunities for us to take a step back and really think about how memory can help us understand not a linear separation between the past, present, and future, or the past separated as if behind museum glass, but the confluence, the commingling, the mutual constitutive nature of the past, present, and future. And I'm going to be talking a lot about this image. This is from Monument Lab's National Monument Audit. It is not a tally of everything that could ever be called a monument in this country, because That's not possible. There's too much debate and questioning about what is a monument, but this is an accounting of nearly 50,000, 48,178 to be precise, conventional monuments around the United States, including each state and each US territory and many tribal communities. This is a first of its kind study. It builds upon the information and ideas gathered by people like the Smithsonian's Save Our Outdoor Sculpture and the Southern Poverty Law Center's Heritage or Hate, but also all kinds of other sources. And I'm going to talk more about this and think about what this map may convey to us and tell us, and also what can't be conveyed in data, what can't be conveyed in map, what is understood in other kind of ways. So now I want to ground us in what Monument Lab is. A Monument Lab is a public art and history studio. We're a nonprofit. You can always support our work in big and small ways. And we started in a classroom. I had moved back to Philadelphia while writing my dissertation about American artists in the Berlin Wall. And I kept bumping into pieces, literally and more so figuratively, of the Berlin Wall in American public spaces. I found them across Washington, D.C., where I was writing my dissertation. I found them in subway stations, and food courts, and presidential libraries, and at least one casino, and public parks. And what I was wondering at that point was, well, if all these pieces of the Berlin Wall have been put up across decades in the United States, what isn't here? Like, what's not being depicted? I met Ken Lum, who is an artist, and he was a new Philadelphian, but we had a real kindred spirit, and we realized our classes that we were teaching at Penn around who was being represented in monuments, who is doing the representing, what is there. There was a kismet between us. And so we worked with a team, and thanks to the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, did a prototype project in the courtyard of City Hall, where we asked a question to as many people as we could in 2015, which was, what is an appropriate monument for the current city of Philadelphia? We asked the late artist Terry Adkins to answer that in the form of a prototype monument, not something that is meant to be permanent or universal. Those are lofty ideals, but ideals at that, but to ground it in the heart of the city. And his answer was he wanted to build an empty classroom, because at this time, as he said, Philadelphia was known for educational innovation and civic spirit. But in 2012 and 2013, we were also known for school closures and budget cuts, disproportionately impacting communities of color around the city. Just think down Germantown Avenue. The old Germantown High was a casualty of this moment of cutting. And what Terry said is that he saw City Hall come to life when parents and teachers and alumni and students came together to be heard and have their voices honored. And he wanted to understand how he could make a statue, or sorry, a sculpture that was not just set off aside, but right in the heart of the city. He was inspired by Joseph Lancaster's vision of a 19th century Quaker schoolhouse, the first, in fact, where teachers were trained to teach, and interpreted it for this site. Here, made and fashioned out of reclaimed wood from Revolution Recovery up in Tacony. Next to this kind of outdoor classroom, we had a different kind of classroom run out of a shipping container where we hired our college students, a public historian, a social worker artist, and we gathered responses and held daily dialogues. And I'll talk more about that lab in a moment. But this is the project that started our work. It changed my life. I had followed a kind of adage of a scholar, Joseph Roach, who said historians should not abandon the archive altogether, but should spend more time in the street. And I thought I would go and I'd train our staff and kind of lean back and think about this site. It changed my life, because every day, whatever was happening anywhere in the city of Philadelphia was happening in City Hall courtyard. There were power brokers, there were people who were protesting, there were people who wanted to trade work for food. There were, at that time, only seating left from the filming of Transformers 2. And we put in benches, and the moment that the fencing came down, people sat in them. We put ramps on either side that people went across in wheelchairs and strollers. I loved watching people who are commuters or travelers carry their rolly suitcase and never even look sideways at the art, but see it as like a place to go through. This is a project that in 3.5 weeks, 35,000 people came to within within working hours. And it set a framework for Monument Lab to build prototype monuments, do participatory research as a way to drive forward our conversation. And I want to be really clear, while we had authorization from the city, we had partners at University of Pennsylvania and other places, we were a passion project. But just by being in public space, it opened up a space of questioning, of dialogue, of understanding that was fascinating. As our work grew, we had other opportunities. We curated a citywide exhibition in partnership with Mural Arts Philadelphia across the 5 squares of William Penn City and 5 neighborhood parks, including our own Vernon Park here, featuring the work of Karen Olivier, who is now lives in Germantown as a Temple professor and originally born in Trinidad, and a public artist of numerous pieces, current and future, in Northwest Philadelphia. Karen's idea was, in this conversation of do monuments reflect us, was to cover a Revolutionary War memorial in a mirror. This was the Battle of Germantown Memorial, dedicated in 1903. And it's meant to be a prototype and temporary, but it was a magnet. It was a mirror. It disappeared in certain angles. The 23 bus reflected in it. There was a woman who cleaned it once a week. And as a curator, you're like, uh-oh, don't touch what, and you got to let it go because it became a part of this space. Though it was up for 2 months, it's been enshrined on the cover of David Young's book about Germantown, on community flyers, and poems by people like Poet Laureate Tripita Mason. And so I want to just highlight this idea that for every monument in the spotlight, or every monument that we think of as there forever and eternal, there's countless others that fade into the background. And how do we bring them to life in new and creative ways? Another example of the kind of work that we do is really about learning in public. And so the artist Sharon Hayes, who teaches at Penn, wanted to note that in our city, with hundreds of historic monuments to men, there are two women who actually lived as full figure statues. Joan of Arc, who is not a famous Philadelphian, and though nonetheless the most monumentalized woman in the United States. And Mary Dyer, a Bostonian Quaker woman. What Sharon did in response as a prototype project was to gather and recreate the plinths where historic men stand in the city and shrink them down to half size. They actually became more human scaled and inviting, and then worked with a group of intergenerational and intersectional women artists and activists, transgender inclusive, to think about the names of women who could have been or still could be honored in this city, with a title of this work that was provocative, but kind of in the spirit of truth-telling, if they should ask. Our work attempts to think about the past, present, and future of monuments, and we had a great opportunity to work with Germantown poet and beloved artist Ursula Rucker on a augmented reality app. You can download it for free on your phone. It works anywhere, but it is optimized for the Art Museum steps, the Rocky Steps. It is the ultimate pedestal in the city. We had this idea before the pandemic, but really during the pandemic, in a moment where we needed social distancing and social engagement and uplift at the same time. This is an opportunity to take a look at the history that's happened there over time in a series of virtual historic markers that pop up and come to life as you go closer to them. To be able to see layers of maps on a map table right there and see sight lines. And of course, we had to do a new art history of Rocky. And I bring this up because I think that it's not about binaries. It's not about between virtual and physical, or old and new, or keep them all up, or it is about meeting points. And this is a project that's all about the meeting point of the physical realm in virtual space, because really what we also like to do in this is collect new ideas and information. There's a plus sign where you can add your ideas and your responses to the questions we asked ourselves. And of course, an ability to meet the muse, Ursula Rucker, and take photos as if she's standing there with you. And again, this is free on iOS App Store and Android, and it will work at the Art Museum steps, but it will definitely work in your own house as well. And speaking of learning, we like to theorize public space while in public space. I'm a professor. I like teaching. I like writing. I do scholarship. But some of the best learning that I've done is with other people in streets and public parks. And so for Monument Lab, now we're a nonprofit. We have a home in right at the corner of North Howard Street and Cecil B. Moore, a block or two away from Fishtown, in a building owned by Materials Conservation, an old firehouse. But for a number of years, we had no office, we had no monument, we had no lab, but we had that in spirit. So we would set up shop in shipping containers in public parks and museum mezzanines and libraries and university classrooms or hallways. And these are spaces where we have hired high school students, college students, and teaching artists to do the work they're already doing, engaging people in questions, asking and thinking, mapping monument proposals or the ways that people see monuments, to not treat monuments as frozen in time, but as part of a civic fabric. We are in a classroom, sometimes it's very interesting to distinguish, like, what's a monument? What's a counter monument? What's a memorial? We like meeting people where they are. And if they see a monument as a story, if they see a monument as a poem, if they see a monument as a grandmother in their community, we want to know that alongside the other kind of comments. And just to note, while we use data and we use augmented reality, there's a part of our work that's pretty old-fashioned, which is we like clipboards, we like pieces of paper, and we like pens and colored pencils and Sharpies. Because if you ever had a moment where you're trying to fill something out online and like you run out of words and you're like, oh, it's not working. And the nice thing about paper is that you can write in the margins or on the back, you can disagree, you can add to it, you can draw if you're inclined, you can write if you're inclined. And we've used this to engage hundreds of thousands of people in person, and tens of thousands of people have engaged with us and left paper forms that we analyze and write up. It's been put in data repositories like Open Data Philly or in university libraries. When we first started this project, I wanted to build like an iPad app, and we had a group of student advisors, and I was like, picture it, it will take 5 minutes in public space. And this group of students humbled me because they said, who has 5 minutes for you? Have you ever tried to use an iPad in the rain? Like, what if you have no charger? Like, no. Make the whole experience from the moment someone sees you in a t-shirt 200 feet away. Can you make something that invites people? And can you make the final moment not just a like, don't ask them questions that you don't know, that you know the answer to. Ask them questions that have a multitude of answers and actually take seriously their responses. It was transformative, and it pushed the way that we think. And in these conversations, as we heard the different ways that people define monument, we came up with a definition that worked for us. Monument as a statement of power and presence in public. A monument as a statement of power and presence in public. That was meant to include bronze and marble figures. That was also meant to include all of those other iterations and traces of the past living in the present. What we kept finding is that if you have the time, the money, and the official power, you build things that you call monuments because they are important to you and they reinforce your place in society. If you don't have the time, the money, or the official power, you have power nonetheless. You build your own monuments, or you gather around monuments that exist, and that's how you make your presence felt. And this is something that sticks out to us, and something I just want to note about the evolution of the City Hall courtyard, that after we did our temporary prototype monument, you can see something the city has put in with the water department, a stage for ongoing ideas. And here, this was an event that we did in 2017 with scholar Salamisha Tillett, artist, rapper, and Tonight Show host, band member, Black Thought, Tariq Trotter of The Roots, and artist Hank Willis Thomas. And I'd be remiss to not point out, speaking of power and presence in public, that in this image, of course, my parents, who I said show up to everything, are also found here. I'm here speaking of the lab and about the lab, but I really represent a team of people. We have been growing. We went from a passion project to now like a young nonprofit startup. And there are people mostly based in Philadelphia, some in New Orleans, some in New York, but Philly is our home. Philly is the place where we have learned about history, and this is the place where we've learned about art, often both of them in public. So I want to give a lot of love and appreciation for all the folks who've been a part of Monument Lab in the past and the future. And I'd be remiss to not name a fellow brilliant Hall of Fame caliber Northwest Philadelphian by birth, Lori Allen, who's there with curly red hair and glasses. Lori and I did not grow up knowing each other, but we met while both working at Haverford College and realized we knew all the same people and had crossed the same paths. And Lori is one of the most brilliant people, not just around monuments and data, but around Philadelphia history. And so hopefully you'll get to engage with her at some point as well. There's a lot of great folks here. This is our firehouse. Hopefully at a safe time, you'll get to visit us there. And here in the back, you can see a new mural that we painted with some of the highlights of our work that inspire us, and our new vision statement, monuments must change. I'll talk more about that throughout my talk. And also, of course, this is painted by the artist Simone Salib. I want to get to the audit and before we get to Q&A. You can see, again, this is a print copy. It's here. This was released in September. It has been read widely, covered by media like the New York Times, NPR, National Geographic. Just today, I had a conversation with someone representing the City of London. And so it's exciting to figure out like who's reading this and what they're making of it, because we really wanted it to be a tool. We were approached by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation over a year ago in the spirit of learning about the monuments that exist. We realized there was no baseline study to go off of, and that as they were investing $250 million in a lot of community-led visionary projects around monuments and public memory, that they wanted to have a baseline understanding of where we've been so we can know where we're going. And so I want to go back to this question of what is a monument? Because our definition that's poetic, a statement of power and presence in public, is great to talk about here with you. But when you are pulling in spreadsheets of hundreds of thousands of lines of data, machines can't take that in. And so that's a big question for us, is like how to create a criteria. For the sake of the audit, we talked and we looked at monuments as a conventional category that were installed in durable materials like bronze or marble, and installed with the authority of a state agency or institution. So we can think about all the different things that could be a monument, but I want to just highlight something with monument data, and a common misconception. I've had it in the past myself, which is that for all the talk that we have about monuments, you would think that there is some central agency out there in charge of all the monuments. They have a list of all the monuments, they greenlight them, they tell us where they've been, who paid for them. That's just a list, like you could Google it, right? That's a reasonable thought, but it is the opposite of the truth. Despite the centrality of monuments, there are no centralized definitions of what a monument is. All of the data sources that we used, they all had either no definition or a definition that said, please use with caution. Monument data has been collected by federal, state, local, tribal, institutional, publicly assembled sources. Sometimes in a moment before we had to drop a pin on the map, so they had to handwrite and observe. Pardon me. and then transfer that online. So I want to say, like, if you've ever tried to pull a cord out of a drawer, that like all of your cords that you've ever owned all get pulled out at the same time, that's like pulling out monument data. And what I want to say is that what we did in order to do this had a rigorous process, a team of 30 researchers, designers, data artists. We gathered all of these records and eventually settled in on 42 sources that were put through multiple algorithms. It's a way of putting things in a computer-based learning system to separate categories and distinctions and materials, and then did hand-checked information with our research team. We've originally found about 500,000 records that could be monuments, but they were all from things that weren't actually tracking monuments. They were tracking cemeteries, public properties. And through that, we were able to hone in on a study set that would be large enough to understand patterns and themes. So this is not a tally of every monument in America or everything that could be called a monument or not. It is a first of its kind sweeping study of the monuments that are out there, the patterns and themes, and the gaps in learning. And I want to say, there's a lot of things in the audit as I read the findings that you all probably know because you've walked around, you've thought about it. But there are new things that we've never been able to ask, never questions that we could peer into monument records from nearly 50,000 places to understand the titles, the writing, the metadata. I also want to say that the questions that we'd love, and many of us want to ask about monuments today, about demographics and representation, a lot of the data sources just don't even include that. Only 6 of our 42 data sources included lines for gender and race. And even when they were available in the spreadsheet, under 15% of the time were any information there. So I want to highlight a lot of the work that we did was cross-stitch different kinds of data to tell stories. One thing I'll share in a moment is that as a way to understand who was being memorialized and monumentalized in our country, we looked for the top 50 individuals who are represented in public monuments. So our findings, I'm going to read them out loud to you and then go through each one briefly before our question and answer. But I want you to kind of do a mental exercise, whether it's in Northwest Philadelphia or somewhere else. As I read these, test them to what you know. Is this comparative? Is this different? And just think about that as a grounding in this work. So our findings, after we gathered the study set and we queried it and we gathered monument experts and practitioners and teachers over the course of the last year, we found these thoughts: that monuments have always changed. The monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male. The most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest. And the story of the United States as told by our current monuments misrepresents our history. So I want to start with monuments have always changed. I know there's an idea that monuments are permanent, but of course, they're always changing. They're changing by the fact of their materiality. Bronze gets patina, marble is affected by rain. A lot of the early American statues built with lead caved in on themselves, were stolen or eaten and nibbled at by squirrels. One of the ways we know that monuments have always changed is because in the data itself, there are fields for dates created, dates amended, plaques added, weather and conditions and wear and tear. And that the question about monument removal has been as old as the nation itself. And as we think about this question about monuments, it's not about what is permanent, what it is not. It is always about the kind of ways that we choose to resource or not resource preservation and maintenance in our culture, which is why one of the things that stood out to us in our audit is that deferred maintenance in the National Park Service is at $12 billion as of fiscal year 2018. So what we invest in now speaks about what's possible for our understanding historically. For their key finding 2, we based our understanding that the monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male on our top 50 figures. And you can read more about them online or in our audit. But I want to highlight some big picture things that of our top 50, because this tells us not who's honored in a single place, but who's honored across the country. US presidents are 11 out of the 50. US generals are 12 out of the 50. And note that that does not include treasonous Confederate generals in this sense. About 76% of the most represented monument individuals own land, and 40% were born into wealth. 50% of the top 50 were enslavers. 44 of the top 50 would be known today as white men. There were no US-born Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, or self-identified LGBTQ plus people in the study. And of those spots that are not represented here, there are 3 women: Joan of Arc, Harriet Tubman, and Sacagawea. And then and in terms of other figures, Dr. Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass, and Tecumseh. Oops. We know that war is a part of the landscape, and I want to kind of highlight, and this thing we look at in our audit, that despite the preponderance of generals on horseback or long memorial rolls of local soldiers fallen, the true costs of war are not indexed in our monuments. And that one of the things that jumped out to us, as we are in a perpetual moment of war and conflict and recovery, as we were finishing this audit, it was the pullout in Afghanistan and the conversation about how it would be memorialized. What we saw in our data was that for every one monument that even mentions peace, there are 13 to war. For every monument that mentions love, there are 17 to war. And for every monument that mentions care, 59 mention war. And so this points us to a reimagining of commemoration that responds to trauma and loss, and really thinking about ways that we can envision a future of memory that is responding to these needs, in and out of so-called conflict time. And then finally, the story of the United States as told by our current monument landscape misrepresents our history. Of the nearly 6,000 recorded monuments that mention the Civil War in our study set, 1% even mention slavery, even mention it. Not the full story. Maybe or maybe not, it's about the accounts of enslaved people, of self-emancipated African-American soldiers who fought for the Union, gathered in nearby Camp William Penn to fight for freedom and for the Union. 1%. The Civil War was undeniably fought over slavery. 3% of the monuments in our study set that mention Confederates, only 3 represent defeat. And of the nearly 1,000 pioneer monuments, only 15% mention Native Americans, Indian, or Indigenous, and that is not counting the pejorative terms. We know that over half of pioneer monuments were dedicated after 1930, which is already in the midst of a Hollywoodization of the Wild West, and after land dispossession and armed conflict against Indigenous peoples. And so I want to highlight this. Like, this is, I thought we had a grasp. We didn't even know how deep it was, right? A single monument being removed or added can be profoundly catalytic. It can really gather people. It's really important to make that change. But we want to make clear, if we don't respond to the large-scale mischaracterizations, we will be missing a really important opportunity to understand how the past impacts the present. Which brings me back to this point of monuments must change. If we want to live to our full creed, if we want to understand how we are thinking about how the past lives into the present, I want us to think about this. And I want to kind of highlight 3 quick things, and we'll go to question and answer, because I hope this might even anticipate some of your questions. And these are some of the questions I get across many contexts from really thoughtful people, and I want to just put out 3 responses there for you, right? What do we do with all the monuments that have been taken down? What are the where are the problematic monuments and who's in charge? Oops. So one of my responses to what do we do with all the monuments that have been taken down? I just want to take a step back and remember that in our audit, we note that 99.4% of monuments were not toppled or removed in 2020 through 2021. So while there's a lot of conversation and emphasis on those that are removed or could be removed, much of what we're talking about are things in situ. And we're not even talking about ones in the spotlight. We're talking about the ones that have been there for a long time and we're wondering what to do with them. I get asked this question, where are the problematic monuments? It's like, where's Waldo? Like, pick it and then we'll get rid. And I just want to say that what we kept seeing is that where inequalities and injustices exist, monuments often perpetuate them. For example, the large number of Confederate lost cause memorials and monuments went in during a period of re-entrenched segregation and Jim Crow. And so rather than trying to find the one to pluck away or to address, let's take a step back and really understand how symbols and systems are interrelated. And then finally, who's in charge of all the monuments? Well, it's really complicated. It's federal, it's state, it's local. But local is key, which is why I'm so glad to talk to you. And so what I want to put out there is that we all play a role, whether it's big or small, every day in maintaining monuments, but also in making history live vibrantly and fully in public space. And so I close here. Despite all of this and the heaviness, I feel hope, I feel inspiration, because I really believe that we can repair and reimagine how history lives with us every day. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess I'm jumping in here. Thank you, Paul. That was wonderful. You're really so inspirational and kind of comprehensive and broad thinking. I mean, it's just fascinating.
No, thank you. I appreciate that.
And we do have a bunch of questions in here that have scattered around. And then some people have been direct messaging me. Well, so one is, Rob Fleming asks, shouldn't the definition of monument be a statement of influence? That's an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert. I mean, I think, yeah, influence is a great thing to put there. I think we use the term power. Influence is key. What I would just say is influence from whom, to whom, for whom. And I'll give a sense. Like one of my questions that I left our early projects with, and it's not something I've ever put into a project, but maybe one day I will, and I use it for classroom visitors or just in the back of my head. Who runs the city? And I love hearing the different answers. I'll ask Jane Golden at Mural Arts, and I'll get an answer about like how to make coalitions of art and happen. I will ask my colleagues at the RARE, which is the artist program at a waste stream facility in Northeast Philadelphia. And they're like, I don't know who runs the city, but I'll tell you this. Stop picking up trash and recycling for a week. You'll see who's in charge. I love talking to people about block captains, about elders, about conservancies. And so I think that, like, while I think that's if Robert, that definition works for you better than ours, go for it. I think the key thing that I want to point out is that there is no, while there's definitely a confluence and a kind of web of ways that power lives in the city, it's not stable. Some of it is long-standing and some of it changes over time. And that's what makes it fascinating, frustrating, and in part, last thing I'll just say, and this is a long way around your question, but I think it's important to note, when there is moments of questioning and striving and democratic action and even uprising, I'm not surprised that monuments are places that are magnetic, because it's much, I say this a lot, but it will sound cheeky, but I believe it. It's much easier to gather around and question a statue than a statute, which is to say that, you know, even if as our monuments have been built across generations, our policies are not written for the layperson. They're not actually like in unlike some recent turns, they're not done in the spirit of transparency. They're often done behind closed doors in arcane ways. And so I think that, look, if you have influence, sway, swag, juice, name your word, you use it. What I love is that sometimes it's the mayor, sometimes it's the city council, sometimes it is the block captain, sometimes it is the person who is an artist who knows everybody and everybody's story. Sometimes it's that person in the Conservancy. I'm not going to point fingers, but you know who you are. Like, you know that you have the sway, you have the influence, but you might want to practice that in concert with other people. So what are coalitions of influence, of power, of presence? That's where I'm really excited to think.
Well, your examples of the various projects that you worked on, I mean, in terms of just broadening the scope of the concept of what a monument is, I mean, and I think that's, I mean, as the audit has so clearly stated, the concept of a monument in the past is largely outdated, and so does not reflect the US as we are today. And so I just thought you gave some great examples of ways that monuments can open up and engage.
Yeah. Do you know what's fascinating with that, Troy? I appreciate that. And again, big credit to my team, who's such great thinkers and keeps me on my toes, and I think vice versa. You know, for the better part of a decade, we have tried to push out the definition of monument because it's been really rewarding, and we were led by the way people answered questions to us. When we asked them what's an appropriate monument for the city, they said, we want restrooms in our public parks, or we want a big megaphone where we can shout to the mayor, or we want like, this seemed, at this point, we're zooming across neighborhoods now, but they wanted in 2015 video screens that you could see across neighborhood lines of division because of legacies of redlining and white flight and disinvestment. And it seems so simple. Like when you say, well, what do you want? And he's like, well, I want to see what's happening across the city. I thought that was profound. Fast forward to the audit. In order to finish the audit, because actually it's not just that monuments have evolved, it's that actually I think that the study of monuments has largely privileged those things that are conventional monuments and not other platforms. Like in the city of Philadelphia, when you ask what's an appropriate monument, people give you murals, they give you mosaics, they give you, I see here, the Pennsylvania Historical Commission signs. Like there is something local, and that's different. When I go to Cleveland, Ohio, or Minnesota, or the Four Corners region, or Alabama, I'm hearing similar but distinct things. And so I think that like what I find really interesting is it's like, what are moments where you have to draw a boundary and you say, all right, we're looking at statues here. Even that's hard. Like, do you include abstract, figural? Like, does it need a pedestal? What if it's on the ground? What if it's in a museum? What if it's a bust, right? That's complicated enough. What I think is key is that it's not just that monuments are evolving, it's our ideas about what's been left behind. Because again, for every monument that is in the spotlight, there is what, 100, 1,000 more that you're like, oh yeah, I drive by that. I have no idea what that is. I am a monument nerd, and I will go by statues and I'm like, wait, I never read that. Like what? You know, and so I think that's a really interesting paradox for us, especially those of us here who care about preservation or maintenance and the social bonds around them. What do we take for granted? And because it's in granite, and what do we know that we have to do? You know, I'm thinking like, for those of you who are able to go out to Stag and Dough Night tonight, you know, like that's filling the avenue in a beautiful way. And I would say if you got a low budget, in terms of not low budget, but like you have a lower budget than building a statue that's meant to last their generation, use light and sound. and you will change the feeling of a space. And I feel the presence of Stag and Doe Night, even though I'm not setting foot there because I'm here with all of you. So
Or
anyway,
the Night of
thinking about
Lights, the
yeah,
Night of Lights from the Chestnut Hill Conservancy, which, you know, it
beautiful
was
project.
amazing. The opening night for that, it was just, I mean, such a, like, so I was manning one of the windows, one of the slideshows, and just incredible energy and positive, you know, the sense of, and connected to Chestnut Hill's history. So,
And people are
that's-
hungry for it. Like, I think that if you have one half a sentence to ask someone or one split second of a highlight reel, you in Philadelphia, you will see who? William Penn, Ben Franklin, and a cheesesteak. Give people like a sentence or a paragraph, and then you're like, oh, okay, well, I'm gonna add the Underground Railroad and I'll add sisters, but then like give us like a night to go hang out on the avenue and see projections. Like people are hungry for that, you know? Yes, and gritty. We could do a whole talk on gritty. Maybe that's the next subject, but like
you're not supposed to be
emergent
watching the
figure.
questions.
No, I know, but I can't, but gritty, even if I'm not seeing gritty, gritty's seeing me.
All right, wait, I'm sorry. So you mentioned the historical markers. Are they a form of monuments? And I thought it was interesting that what you said, because historical markers are, of course, a construct of a group that decides what's important. And so therefore they are reflect decisions that are made. I mean, they may not be monuments themselves, but sorry, over to you.
Yeah. Well, I think you know, just clarity for the sake of the audit, they were not included in the National Monument audit. Our team looked at the data for the sake of our understanding about public memory. Absolutely, like I'm fascinated by them. I think in large part, I every semester that I teach, I make my students like draft them or rewrite them, because on one hand they're bigger than they have more text than a lot of things in public, but like they have a limit, and you got to make word choices, and all like we say we're word nerds in addition to monument nerds. And you know, if you use the passive voice on a sign, this land was settled, or people were lost, people were killed, like these things really matter in the act of truth telling. Like people find that like you can hide and or open up possibility. What I really appreciate about the Pennsylvania Historic Commission signs is like reading a book outside in the city, and they all had a sponsor. They all had some, like they didn't just appear on a map. I don't know, we don't always get that story, but for anyone here who's been a part of that process, often it's on the dedication day. It's really special, you know. And I think I've loved seeing young people lead. I've loved seeing intergenerational, and maybe, you know, the future of monument marker and historic marker data could account for both what it says on the sign, and also what was the dedication like, and what is the process of bringing that into broader conversations about living memory.
Right, because there was that one that just went up just off Vernon Park on Germantown Avenue about the African-American catering. Right,
That's
that
right.
was, I think, pushed by Oscar Beisert, who's the
yeah,
irrepressible Oscar Beisert.
yeah, who is like a real, you know, who's an incredibly important person in this city. I met Oscar many years ago when we both lived in Washington, D.C. And I remember you saying you moved to Philly, and next thing I knew, here is a person who is on one hand using, like I said, big and small ways, like is not the day job, but he has been he's like welcomed into the city, but he's been a force for caring about preservation in profound ways, and he's one person who helps build possibilities. So I love that, George, to say like, okay, well, it's about like, let's learn about the African-American caterer in Germantown. And by the way, let's think of the groups of people. I'm thinking even by there, the ACES Museum, the Black Writers Museum, Center in the Park, like those places that are monumental and also part of the communities that change and getting it together.
Just in case anybody didn't know, Oscar Beisert is a gentleman who works for FEMA, but during the daytime, but he has something called the Keeping Society, and he nominates buildings to be listed for the city registry. And he does it all night long, as far as we can tell. I think he's a national treasure. So
That's right. That's right.
But all right, we're looking now. There's several questions, and I know this is going to sort of lead us off into this topic away from sort of new monuments and the definition, but back to the subject of kind of reframing or grappling with existing historical monuments. I just add in this comment that it was when I was being heckled at that lecture. The gentleman had an interesting point, and the problem is the way he heckled was so inappropriate that the whole thing ended up. And the problem is, of course, there's always a kernel of interest in these discussions, but the way he talked about the fact that the monuments as they are part of American history, and of course that's true. But they document what rich white men could, and I'm going to add in just because it's just to tweak Chestnut Hill, I'm going to say heterosexual, mostly rich white men, what they could do, and they were the people with money. And so, in fact, it was a bit of history. And so, so the question is, I mean, I think Laurie asked and that Carolyn asked a sort of but I mean, how do we recontextualize? How do we reframe? What do we do? I mean, my interest is like Teddy Eskin, the statue in the Wissahickon, which of course has all sorts of problems with it, but is sort of beloved. But I mean, how do we figure out how to recontextualize these? And it's a challenge, right?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I want to do is find out from people who haven't always been asked. I want to hear from, if it's an indigenous figure, I want to hear from indigenous people and multiracial collectives. I want to hear from artists. I want to hear from educators. I want to hear from lots of people without foreclosing what will happen in the future. That feels to me like a starting point and generative. Just in terms of, I don't know if you're hecklers here, but let me just read from page 25 of the audit. And it's a page where we also note that less than 1% of recorded monuments represent enslaved peoples and abolition efforts. Less than 1% of monuments, okay? So monuments offer interpretations of the past and play an outsized role in shaping historical narratives and shared memory. In the service of remembering the preferred narratives of their creators, they can also erase, deny, or belittle the historical experience of those who have not had the civic power or privilege to build them. Where inequalities and injustices exist, monuments often perpetuate them. Monument makers often strive for surface-level markers of historical accuracy, paying close attention to authentic details of clothing, of weaponry, and quotation. But they often eclipse social factors that inform public memory and the broader context. This includes elevating figures as singular without the people who made their contributions possible, or situating them in places they never set foot. Monuments suppress far more than they summon us to remember. They are not mere facts on a pedestal. We go on from there. And those are words written by myself and co-editors Sue Mobley and Laurie Allen, and members of our team. And I think that monuments are part of the historical landscape, but history does not live inside of statues. It lives between people. It lives in systems. And I think that I think that, like, let's update our ideas. Let's see fully. Let's understand what they do tell us and what they don't. And there is no single story of a place. There is just none. If you are hearing someone say there's a single story of this place, just take a step back, you got your tea, and say, okay, well, let's go. Because there's geological history, there's indigenous history, there is probably histories of freedom and of enslavement when we're talking about the United States. We're looking at systems of opportunity and of exclusion. And so anytime someone says there's a single story and they protect it, and in certain places they bar other stories, or they try to ban them, or try to, that's when you know, oh, okay, that's the problem of trying to like hold on to things as the way they are. Because we don't hold on that closely to housing or neighborhoods in the same way sometimes we do for a statue. So I just I appreciate people caring about a place. I don't think there's one solution to what to do. I think that it's worth thinking about your intention. If your intention is for history to live in dynamic ways, and that we want to live in a way that's in accordance with our values and visions, then it's worth thinking about and setting up intentionally processes to learn and grow. If you don't, if you want to hold on to the way things are, and you want to pretend that there's no need for greater justice and like more stories to live in public, then do you. That's the way it's going to be. And so I think it's important. I love intergenerational conversations. I love points where we can talk about the multiple stories. It's empowering, it's enlivening. I know it can feel scary, but I have to say, I've been on the other side of it where it feels like it changes you, because you learn and grow with people mutually.
I agree. I'm just looking for Carolyn. Carolyn Adams says, can moving monuments away from war help to move our country away from the wagon train mentality? Interesting question.
That's from Carolyn Adams.
Yes.
Thank you, Carolyn Adams. I think there's a lot in your question that is like, it's worth its own panel. You know, it's really powerful. I mean, I think in a way, we can't do away with more memorials and monuments, because war is an ever-present condition in our country, you know. And when I say war and conquest, I'm talking about the wars that, you know, make it in our history books, but also about conquest, about land dispossession. I am struck by, I was just in Minneapolis, and I'm just gonna say, like, I have a PhD, but I did not know that during the Civil War, the Union waged war against the Lakota people. I didn't know it. And I did not know that a site of trauma, of execution of Native elders, was also the place where Dred Scott, an enslaved man who went north to try to claim his freedom, was held. Like that, and it was on the banks of the Mississippi River. And I was like, wow, I didn't even understand this connection. Actually, Monument Lab next year is embarking on a new podcast project called Plot of Land, where we're going to look at the connections between land, history, and memory, and housing as a part of that. So I think we have to face war, but I do think that we can reimagine. I have heard from of groups of veterans, of their families, people who say, like, we do actually want resources for healing. We want responses to post-traumatic stress. Monuments and memorials can participate in that, but if that's not their goal, then it's harder to get back to that. And so there are countless examples of this across the country, but I'd say look for those. Look for those. Sometimes they're in stone and marble, but sometimes it's really moving just to see how people remember those around them and make those connections to build peace.
Yes. I'm just thinking about have you read Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States?
Mm-hmm.
Which is just absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, it was a world-changing experience to read that book. It's fascinating. Our church book club is doing it as well right now. So, wow. But I was thinking about the Lakota, the war with the Lakota. I was just going to ask, you didn't talk in your talk about the latest phase that you've been working on just recently, which is the linkages with local organizations all across the country, including here. Yes, I mean, is there some? Yes. So could you tell us a little bit? I mean, we're going to sort of start to wrap up, but just because we don't want to keep everybody endlessly, but could you tell us a little bit about that? So
yeah, gladly. Thank you for that reminder. I've tried to fit a lot in there, so it's great to be able to hear. So, you know, we've wrapped up the audit. It was the hardest project we ever did, but it's been really exciting. It's a tool for learning. It's being used across the country and outside of the country. And that was the goal. And we hope one day it will be outdated. That's good. That's a goal. We want it to evolve and be a layer of learning. And we're excited we've been hearing from educators. We've been hearing from municipal audiences. But one of the reasons we did the audit was to understand what's there. And we also know that monuments are national and international, but they're local phenomenon and people may remember differently. And so our team built into our project in the audit a second phase that is sub-granting out $1 million across 10 teams that we curated through an open call. We received applications from every US state, most territories, tribal nations. It was so moving to see. They had to be teams. They had to think about memory in really interesting ways. I mean, it was fascinating and very humbling. And our team just thought it was a profound process. We brought in a jury. We settled in on 10 teams who next year in the project ReImagination, which by the way, is, the spirit is biological, it's ecological, but also refers to Frederick Douglass writing in the 19th century in response to the Civil War, saying we need a national regeneration, which is to fund projects that are happening. And so we have projects in LA, the Four Corners region, Puerto Rico, Montgomery, Alabama, South Dakota, and of course, one of those places right here in Philly, Northwest Philly, really to be precise. So it'll take place across the city and is led by the brilliant poet laureate past and poet laureate present, Yolanda Wisher and Trapita Mason. And it's called Consensus. They call it sisterly history because in this city of Philadelphia, where we have all kinds of visions of history, Black women poets have been central to our understanding of ourselves more broadly. And as they've said, it's no coincidence that Germantown is a major point of convergence. Of course, the great Sonia Sanchez is a Germantown resident, but others, Ursula Rucker, Trapita Mason, Yolanda Wisher, others, like Germantown is a really special space in addition to other places around the country. So from May Day, May 1st to Labor Day in September, across the country, including right here in Philadelphia, there will be special projects. There will be installations, activations, engagement projects here in Philadelphia. Yolanda Wisher and Trapita Mason are interested in doing a consensus, is the name of their project, consensus, but with cis at the end to speak to past, present, and future Black women poets and understand their experiences, and then work on a series of public activations that experiment with new kinds of markers and monuments and bring poetry in them. So that's exciting here. And I would just say there's other things that Monument Lab is up to, and we love making new friends. You can always support our work at monumentlab.com. We have a store online where you can get some Monument Lab swag. I think word on the street is there's some sales going on, and all of it supports our work because we're a small but mighty team. We're headed in early January. We're opening a public classroom in the Smithsonian Futures exhibition, where we're going to, a lot of what we talked about here will be there. So whether you find us in Philly or somewhere else, know that we're always home here. And we're just excited to be able to think with everybody. And, we all need bright spots. We all need inspiration. We're dealing with heavy work. And if we can find each other in those moments and build space for coalition, but also be purposeful, speak truth to power, find healing, let history live in its fullest ways, then we hope that's a way to get on through together.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Laurie, would you like to make a little final?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you again, Paul. This has been a very thought-provoking presentation. I'm very, very interested in reading your census and seeing what we can do in our communities. So I very much appreciate all that you've brought to the city and to the United States in terms of how we're seeing things and how the lens through which we can see other things really grateful for how you've created these spaces for alternative voices to be, or voices that are alternative to what we've typically heard from, that you've created this space for people to really feel safe to come forward and represent themselves and the things that they've seen and experienced proudly. It's really important for people to be able to see themselves, and and as an organization that's documenting and sharing and interpreting history, I think it's really important for the Conservancy and everyone that is a part of this group to be thinking about our monuments and how we recognize and celebrate and what we share, and so I just want to say thank you for creating this space and for sparking this conversation.
Oh, well, I feel so much gratitude. Like I said, there's nothing like coming home. So I appreciate that. And just to everyone at the Conservancy, to you, Lori, to Leah, to Jean, and of course, George, and all the supporters, it's just really wonderful to be with neighbors, and of course, family, and new friends as well.
And your parents.
That's right.
Back on.
Well, they know. Yeah.
We talked at your event.
Dave Farber parents. Well, again, thanks everyone for attending tonight. We're really, really, again, grateful to Paul for his talk. Grateful to Susan and Jean for the wonderful programs that they've put together over 2021 with George McNeely, even though he's not named as a co-chair. Thank you also to Leah Silverstein for organizing so much of what we do. And wish you all a good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Paul.